Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with The Future of Man by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. This book was originally published back in 1959. It got an English translation in 1964 by Norman Denny, and that is the edition that I read. So, The Future of Man by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. I wanted to read this. I read another book by de Chardin, The Phenomenon of Man, over here, and I will link to that chat down in the details below. But, this is a lot of information in this book, so I got a lot to get through. I'm going to try to keep it to my normal time. But there's a lot of sort of really interesting concepts around consciousness, which is one of the main reasons I actually wanted to read some additional works by de Chardin because of this history of consciousness and also human consciousness and where it may be evolving into the future. And these are all topics that are addressed in this book. This book is actually a series of essays that each chapter is an essay, some of which had been unpublished prior to the publication of this book. Looks like there are 22 of them, 22 different essays, and they were all written and some were previously published, but they were written really throughout the middle of the 20th century, anywhere from around 1920 up until like the late 1940s, I noticed, and maybe some early 1950s in there too. I don't really remember. I did not keep track of that. But how I thought I would approach this chat, since it's so much in here, is just really address some of the sort of the key sort of themes that I took away from the book personally. I'm not qualified necessarily to teach a subject this complicated, but nevertheless, I just will pull out some of the most interesting parts that I found in the book. So some key thoughts here. The first one is humans differ from other species in that instead of breaking up into multiple other species like subspecies, like most animals do, if you're separated, like birds get separated for very long, they develop quickly into a different species. And this has not been the case for humanity. We don't. There's only currently one species of human with the same consciousness. And then he argues that this human species, actually our evolution is primarily spiritual. It's our consciousness that is what is evolving. And there's a quote here that says, instead of breaking up into subspecies, it coils inward upon itself and thus generates new spiritual energies and a new form of growth, a process of reflection, which is a part and parcel of reflection. So you see the difference in the spelling, reflection and reflection. What causes the reflection with an S is reflection. It's our consciousness. It's our consciousness changing over time. Another kind of key thought that I took away from the book was that the universe is not a dead material thing. It is a system, and we are merely elements. We are elements within the system, very important elements because of our unique consciousness that we have that separates us from other animals in the sense of we have a more awareness of a future and a context. So our consciousness is different than the more survival-based, instinct-based animals, he argues. So we are these parts of the universe. We are little discrete units. So if you think about a body being, this is how I interpreted it. If you think of a body being a collection of cells, and the cells are actually independent little living things on their own, right? But aggregated together, they make you. And then so the universe is basically composed of these elements, and we are one of the complex sort of components of that with our consciousness. We're one of the complex sort of cells of a more universal system. There's a quote here that I think really also helps explain this from the book. It says, "No one can any longer doubt that the universe, conceived in experimental or phenomenal terms, is a vast temporal spatial system, corpuscular in nature, from which we cannot sensorially escape, except even in thought, in any direction. Viewed in this light, everything in the world appears and exists as a function of the whole. This is the broadest, deepest, and most unassailable meaning of the idea of evolution. So evolution is not so much a story of well, it is a story of also of biology changing over time, but in the sense of it is the universal evolution is a story of organization. It's humanity's greatest challenge to continue to organize ourselves in more tightly in a more tight manner. So he argues that over the course of human history, we started out very spread out, very discrete small units, small little family units, and then more tribal units, then city units, and then national units, and then ultimately there will be some sort of global unit where we will function as a whole. And then he argues that we do this primarily through love. This is how we will achieve this goal. Now, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit priest, so he approaches this kind of love in sort of the Christian Christ type of love, which is the love of one another, love of that sort of Christ kind of love. But that love is what holds us all together. So, as we aggregate, if we're missing the love, what we wind up with is totalitarianism, right? But if we have the love, then we can achieve something different. There's a quote here that I think is kind of cool about that. It says, "I know very well that by a kind of innate obsession, we cannot rid ourselves of the idea that we become most masters of ourselves by being as isolated as possible. But is not this the reverse of truth? We must not forget that in each of us, by our very nature, everything is in an elemental state, including our freedom of action. We can only achieve a wider degree of freedom by joining and associating with others in an appropriate way." He's saying here that freedom, to be free, is not to be free of other people, but actually to be joined with them and working with them in this sort of spirit of cooperation. And partially that's done through education, and then partially that's done through this sort of spirit of love, like I mentioned. So he also talks about the noosphere. So the noosphere is like we had the ecosphere, right? The biosphere, the atmosphere. And so the noosphere is this knowledge. It's sort of the global ether of global, what we might today say something like global culture. It's the global, it surrounds us all, and it's the global sort of human created way of knowing. It's the human atmosphere that we've created, and that we change this individually. We are each an elemental part of it. Each person contributes to this noosphere, either for the positive or for the negative, and some move it along, and then others try to contract it, and I'll talk more about that here in a bit. But he says here about the noosphere, he says, all around us, tangibly and materially, the thinking envelope of the earth, the noosphere, is adding to its internal fibers and tightening its network. And at the same time, its internal temperature is rising, and with this, its psychic potential. So as the noosphere expands, the temperature of that, it becomes more dense, and the temperature rises, and therefore there's more energy in there. The noosphere, he's writing in the middle of the 20th century, the noosphere has exploded in the last 30 years with the internet, for sure. So our noosphere is vastly different, I would say, than it was back when this essay was originally written. And I think that's really cool. He goes on to say, I have already attempted a sort of anatomy of the major organs of the noosphere. It remains for me to show that these separate parts, planetary in their dimensions, are not designed to remain in a state of rest. The formidable wheels turn and circulate throughout the gigantic system. What goes on around us in the human mass is not merely a flurry of disordered movement, as in a gas. Something is purposefully stirring, as in a living being. So the noosphere is a living thing. It is a huge, gigantic system of which we are contributing. Even by me creating this video and by you watching this video, you are contributing to the noosphere. You are contributing then to this sort of global network, the system that envelops the earth. And I think that is so cool. And ultimately, he talks about how the conflicts of the world actually are revolved around this. There are people who want to progress, so embrace knowledge and embrace new knowledge and the change that new knowledge brings. There are those who accept that and want to move forward, and then there are those who resist that and try to hold back from that. And then therein lies the conflicts. And he talks about peace, how to build a lasting peace. And I think this essay, if I remember right, was written sometime in like 1947, the late 1940s, so right after World War II. And so he's saying that lasting peace cannot occur until humanity as a whole understands itself well enough to know that we share this kind of consciousness, and that we share this kind of evolutionary consciousness that is changeable, and that it must change, that the whole force of the universe is change. That's the energy of the universe, driven by love, as I mentioned. He goes on to say, there's a quote here about that says, "Why is it, finally, that men are still so painfully incapable of agreeing among themselves? Why does the threat of war still appear so menacing? Is it not because they have not purged themselves sufficiently of the demon of immobilism?" I love that. The demon, he describes immobilism, those who do not wish to move things, as being sort of possessed by some sort of a demon of immobilism, inaction. The human purpose is action. The human consciousness is action. We are evolving. We are changing. But what causes conflicts and ultimately wars is those who recognize that and want to move forward in sort of an evolutionary progress forward towards a healthy integration of all of humanity and all of our consciousnesses, and those who resist that change and have this demon of immobilism, which I thought was so cool. All right, that is a summary of my key thoughts from this book. It's really a collection of essays. It's sort of a companion to the phenomenon of man. You will also notice here the omega. He did not talk about the omega point too much in this particular book, this collection of essays, but the omega point is, in his mind, is where humanity does reach this sort of consensus and becomes then, when we become united, he uses the sort of Christian framework of sort of a Christ consciousness with each other, we will evolve then into a completely different thing. We will have a different type of consciousness at that point, one we don't currently know what it is or recognize. He calls that the omega point. He doesn't talk about that too much in here, but it is in the phenomenon of man if you're interested to learn more about that. All right, I will close the chat with that. My next chat is going to be, let me just call up the book. It's going to be some fantasy, some Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan fantasy, book 5. I've been making my way through this series slowly, so just finished book 5. I will have a chat on this coming up soon. So until next time, take care.